value of price of a slave.
It would increase it and people would like start to breed them so they could sell them themselves.
That's right. So yes, the price went way up as demand skyrocketed. Remember, 1808 is really only 15 years after the invention of the cotton gin. But I wanted to remind you before we got going too much further, just a little bit about the history of the legality of slavery, because sometimes we forget, and critics of American history, our history, will sometimes point out, from the very beginning of our nation, we've had enshrined in it elements of slavery, and there's truth to that. There were really three components of the Constitution that dealt with the issue of slaves in the Constitution itself. Right? If you recall, they didn't use the word slave, other persons, okay? But most notably or notoriously, the Three-Fifths Compromise. They had something, the 1808 number is not by accident. In the Constitution, they said the international slave trade could not be regulated for 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution. They basically put a hold order on any discussion of that. So that's why it was 1808 and not any years sooner, because the international slave trade was actually accepted by most Americans as kidnapping. So in other words, the process of going to Africa and capturing people by the 1800s was well known to be sort of kidnapping. Okay. That being said, there was a clause in the Constitution that would be enforced under a law called the Fugitive Slave Act. And so what the Fugitive Slave Act said is that if someone that was bound to servitude or to service somewhere else was discovered, it was your duty to, they were to be returned. In other words, that was not, you weren't free just because you made it to a state that didn't have slavery. You were just runaway property, if that makes sense. So in many ways, while we think about running across the Ohio as escaping from slavery, the Ohio River in Kentucky, really the ultimate destination for many runaways was Canada. There was no way to not be a slave as long as you were a runaway. Then the Brits had outlawed slavery earlier. Brandon asked here in class, did Canada have slavery? Slavery never really took off, in Canada. It just didn't have any reason to, there was no like large scale plantation. But if you look here, like the British had outlawed the slave trade in 1807 and then completely abolished it throughout the entire British Empire in 1833. The work of a guy named William Wilberforce, who's really a historically fascinating person, and a guy named Olaudah Equiano, who was an escaped slave who could write and read and was really the kind of walking testament to why slaves should be free people. So anyway, the MoComp that we talked about was a law dealing with slavery, and then we're going to get to a 1850, another slave law that will deal with. In the Fugitive Slave Clause of 1850, it became a crime to not help capture runaway slaves. And that is going to be one of the most divisive moments in American history, because what it's going to do overnight is say, all right, let's say before you were apathetic about the whole issue of slavery, one way or the other. And so when people ran away, you're like, whatever, it's their problem. Now, if you saw them and did not assist in their capture, did not turn them in, did not notify law enforcement, you were committing a crime as a person, basically the crime of omission of helping capture a runaway slave. So that was a very, very, very unpopular law in the North, one in which they nullified on a large scale. So we'll talk about that when we get to what's called the Compromise of 1850s. And sometimes I know I do like foreshadowing for you guys, but there it is. So what the Deep South is. So there'll be several names that are associated with the Deep South. One will be the Cotton Kingdom. So you have the Upper South, which are primarily the states of Virginia, Kentucky, Maryland, right? So up here, you have the Upper South. And then you have sort of the Middle South in Tennessee and North Carolina. And then you 7 states here. Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. These 7 here are routinely called the Deep South or the Cotton Kingdom. Okay, sometimes it's called the Cotton Belt. Other times it's even called the Black Belt. And again, you can see these states here. What is interesting to me about this, I put this on here because if you look up here at the top, the purple colored counties, these are maps of all the counties in America. And if you look at this deep shade of purple, or whatever this color is at the top, that's African American. And so if you look here, this is today, by the way, this is present Census Bureau map. So do you see the overlap? I mean, it's clear what counties in America that are overwhelmingly African American are these same counties as the Cotton Kingdom. I mean, you guys see this right here, right? So here's Louisiana, and you see these counties right through here. Now, northern Alabama, not so much, right? Northeastern Mississippi, so this is right around Talladega. So right through there, you come back here, right through there, right? Right through there. So it's obvious today where the bulk of African Americans are who live in America. Keep in mind, it's the largest population. So that means the majority of these counties are African American, the ones that are this dark purple. And they are the same counties where the largest plantations in America. So that's not, it doesn't take rocket science to figure out why it looks like it. Okay, so yeah, I would definitely be familiar with the Cotton Kingdom. And yesterday we discussed what being sold down the river was.
This isn't like completely related
okay.
to something, but I'm just out of curiosity.
Huh?
Why is there like more and more counties as you go east?
Okay, so Gabriel asked a question about why are the counties so much like smaller in the east than they are? It's a variety of answers to that. Partially is that these counties were not, the counties you see here were actually devised under the land ordinance of 1785. So that's that. Remember those block boxes that were squared out? All of that was designed. Looked literally like boxes. The West was not settled that way at all. And in fact, the largest landowner in all of these 6 states here is the federal government. So a lot of that is not populated at all. I don't know why counties got their shapes like they are here, per se, but yeah, you can almost see where the population, this is what we call a 100th meridian. The 100th meridian, which is the line of longitude, is where rainfall stops, basically. So this is like where it gets dry. And it's as if people just stop going there. So I don't know for sure why the counties look quite this way, but definitely interesting to note how very checkerboarded these are. I think they imitated it in these states. But these states were much later to come in. Yeah. So yeah, that's interesting about the land size. Sure. So we were talking about being sold down the river. Okay, and down the river would be, look at the purple along, you guys know the Mississippi River is the western border of Illinois. So if you're coming down the map here, here's the Mississippi River, right? So, and you think about, here's the Ohio River, which is the northern border of Kentucky, folks at home. But here's the Ohio, and here's the Mississippi. And Missouri comes across here. So slavery doesn't exist north of the Ohio River, right? But when you talk about getting sold down the river, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, and particularly our part, west, we're the Piedmont West, slavery was never that big to begin with here, right? And excuse me, and the slaveholders had plateaued on value, meaning I'm going to say they had a surplus of slaves, but it was costing them more to upkeep having slaves than it would be just a higher day labor. So they're like, what do we do with these slaves? And in fact, they were going to end slavery, I think, in Virginia by 1832, if not for well, I don't know, it's debatable, so that's a story we'll call it. Nonetheless, this is where the demand was. So when you think about Louisiana, eastern Louisiana particularly, you think about the Mississippi and its state. This is where you would be sold after this event happened. So I told you yesterday that the poor white man in the South probably was never intending to be a slave owner just because slaves were very expensive. And I think maybe I need to quantify that. not just say that, but show you. So let's take a minute and shift away from the PowerPoint. And I know some dollar amounts, but I want to look up to remember. And I hate this impersonal way of discussing slaves, but that's the reality of it. So if I'm going to, let's 1820, that's a census year, so usually a pretty decent year. 1820 price of slave. And keep in mind, slaves came in, a variety of ways you would want to purchase a slave. All right. So if you go back to, I don't know the source, but we'll take a look at it. Okay, it's from Northwestern, so maybe decent. $2016. So Louisiana male, 18 to 30. And here you can, okay, this is a great way to understand the value. You can see here, where is the highest value of a slave? So if you're looking at this chart, where is the price value going to hit the highest?
Deep South.
No, I'm sorry. I'm not talking about, okay, yes, geographically, the Deep South. They call that here the New South. New South meaning like the Deep South, but also the age group. That's what this is. So what's peak price age-wise? Well, it looks like mid to late 20s. Very good.
Anywhere between 24 and 30 by the looks of it.
Yep, 24 to 30-year-old male. Right. So that would be your most valuable purchased person. And keep in mind, that's not if they were skilled. So if they were a skilled slave, and again, Thomas Jefferson, his chef at Monticello was a slave who he had taken to France to train to cook French cuisine. So I mean, I mentioned Thomas Day, this extraordinary gifted artisan. All the craftsmen in the South were slaves. There was no sort of yeoman mercantile class in terms of businessmen, to speak of. And so here you can see the price of a slave over time. All right. And so I'm going to copy this image. And again, it looks like this person has done quite a bit of research. So Northwestern's a respectable institution. And you can see here the height of the cost right prior to the Civil War, right? But also jumping up dramatically after the cotton gin, right? And so comparable to today's cost. So this is why it's very hard to equate it, because you had to kind of count into it over time, the long-term investment. And this is the kind of numeric calculus that would be going on in the mind of a slave owner when he bought a slave. But if you're looking up here, by 1820s, what would be the overall cost of the labor value of one slave, according to this? A $400 price in today's prices would be $92,000. So let that sink in. A $400 would be $92,000. So when I talk about owning one or two slaves, that was, for most people, the most you could hope for. You understand? That would be an astronomically high sum of money to pay, $90,000 today. So that's the reality of the prices of slavery. I said I wanted y'all to see that, because I feel like sometimes I'm just talking about it and you guys don't recognize it. So that is a staggering dollar amount. And now you can see, and perhaps see, why people would be willing to fight over this. Well, many of the folks who were slave owners were deeply in debt. Thomas Jefferson had to sell most of his slaves, his estates, all most of his slaves, so that Monticello would be repossessed. So yeah, just mammoth dollar amounts. So, and I don't think that is the kind of thing that people, when they talk about, hey, everybody enslaved, I'm like, no, they certainly did not. A child would cost you like what a brand new F-250 would cost.
More than a brand new Tesla.
Well, right. So now keep again, this was something that you were expecting a long-term return on your investment. So I chose to put this stuff in here because this is why businesses in America, like Currier and Ives and others, romanticize slavery. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. You don't want to make it look as evil as it is. You understand? So in the North and the South. So this is, I mean, when I talk about the fact that people did not like criticism of this, it's because it would disrupt the entire economic system of our country. So this was the idea, is you would, in essence, rent a slave and hopefully impregnate a slave, and that child would be someone you would be able to sell. That's Harriet Beecher Stowe's horrible account of the selling of families, the breaking up of families, because of the slave auction. Again, Deep South, highest value. Working field hand men, the highest value. And less skilled artisans. So craftsmen like carpenter or something like that. Okay? So lots of cost. Slaves are also used in other industries in the South. Don't forget that sugar existed, smaller scale. Tobacco will continue, but overwhelmingly cotton. Now, you'll hear a phrase about the South slavery called peculiar institution routine. The reason they use it is there are several things about American slavery that are distinctive. For example, American slavery is the only modern form of, and by modern I mean not like ancient history, form of slavery that's self-perpetuating. If you're not sure what that means, it means that slaves gave birth to children who were slaves. In other societies throughout history, slaves were prisoners of war. Slaves were, like temporary servants. In America, slavery perpetuated. It grew. And so when you look at why slavery's population increased, it was natural reproduction. It was not through importation of more slaves. You might have been outlawed. But it was really just breeding and having lots of children, and that continued. Now, the South was also really the only Western society or civilization to still have slavery. And they didn't like to talk about it as slavery. They called them their servants, routine. So it was one of these things where it was like, everybody knew it was wrong and nobody talked about it. So, unfortunately.
What exactly is peculiar?
Well, it's a term to show that it was different than other places. It was unique kind of to the South. And it was very much a Southern institution. So in other words, it was so deeply, I don't use the word integrated, but ingrained in the Southern mindset. Slavery meant that people's understanding of what Black people were, this is why free Blacks had such a hard time, because white people looked at a Black person and thought inferior. They thought servile. They thought, savage. And that was normal. Keep in mind, the South had the largest diversity by this period because a third of its population are Black people. So one of the things that they were frequently critical of the North about is that when Northern abolitionists started talking about ending slavery, they're like, oh, that's easy for you to say. You don't know there are any Black people. You understand? You don't know what it's like to be with Black people. So that was a common defense. Now, one of the things I've read routinely is that there was no single form of slavery. You understand? Like, in other words, there were many common characteristics, but slavery was a local and state law. So that meant, as an institution, it varied literally from county to county at times. But what seems pretty routine is that it was brutal labor. The kind of labor that you would not want to do in your house, all right? And yet they did it all day, every day, that they could. So, as I said, one slave told a guy interviewing him later that he said it was like all night forever. It was, no end to toil. Usually, white men who were not wealthy could get a job as an overseer. An overseer would be someone who would make sure that the count for, let's say, the cotton was proper. And if not, they would whip the slaves. But in other words, the masters rarely got their hands dirty. Keep in mind, some of these plantations are the size of counties. Right? Yeah, right. Yeah, county size. So they're not like, they're like these states in Europe. And so they have these managers who would drive the slaves. And these are the guys you would often see on a horseback whipping slaves in a cotton field. Okay? Second, no rights at all under the law. None. No civil rights, no political rights. You could not serve on a jury. You could not testify unless white people told you you had to. You never, ever were going to be able to vote. Your marriage was not recognized. There were no formal marriages between slaves. In fact, when slavery ends in America in 1865, formally ends, and the Civil War ends, the very first action that most slaves do that are adults is to get their marriages official. They get marriage license. You know, because they want to be like recognized by the law. Violence was constant. This is one of the things that Frederick Douglass would talk about, and later on in history, Martin Luther King. In order to hold people down in the gutter, you must get down in the gutter with them. So what that meant was, in order to get these people to work hard, there was no financial incentive. It's not like getting paid more. So they would be beaten. But, let's be clear, beating them till they died would not be smart. Not if you're paying $90,000 for it. So there are journals that I've read, accounts of trying to bribe slaves with alcohol, giving them days off, negotiating with them. So every plantation had its own sort of unique experience. But the key to take away is that for none of these people were they free. Their body was not theirs. Now, what I do know to be almost uniformly consistent is it was against the law to teach slaves to read and write. You can see here, between the period after the Missouri Compromise, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, both Carolinas, Missouri, and Virginia all passed laws against teaching slaves how to read and write. South Carolina said you would have a 100-pound fine, 6 months in prison if you taught a slave to read and write. So, and they were constantly on the white folks were constantly on the look to see if slaves seemed to be understanding what they were looking at. You know, like they wanted to, for example, a lot of times here in the upper South, you would have a plantation or a big farm, and then you would have a general store. You know, like a Dollar General, only it was a general store. And they would give a list of goods to their slave to go get from the grocer on credit. You know, they always paid on credit. And they would try to notice if their slave was reading, you know, and that would be, you know, very bad. That would be the kind of stuff.
So what about the slaves that lived in the house?
So Gabriel asked, what about the slaves that lived in the house? It was illegal for them to read and write too. And we're going to get to in a minute the fact that many of them did learn to, at the very least, read. At least some degree. And they certainly knew what was newsworthy. Because here's the funny thing about owning slaves in the house. Domestics were invisible. If you go to Monticello, and when you're talking at Monticello to the folks there about how slaves were, Jefferson designed the interior of the house to make sure that the slaves weren't noticeable. So that when you were inside Monticello, you weren't really, and they were really well dressed, and you know things were brought up by pulleys and elevators, and so the slaves were sort of like in the background. In fact, they were in everyone's background, you know, in the South, who had slaves. And so they definitely heard what people thought. And that's going to be a very big deal when you think about the year 1804. Anybody here know why the year 1804 is such a big deal in the South? It's okay. I wouldn't expect it to be off the top of your head. So in a country called Santo Domingo, we're going to call it Haiti, a black man led a revolution of slaves who overthrew a white government and created a white country. All right, Toussaint Louverture. That's Haiti in 1804, y'all. That meant the words of what Louverture did spread. And so that absolutely horrified white planters. You know, and you better believe they're like, don't gossip about, don't talk about, you know. They did not want people hearing about slavery. Because that was the worst thing that could happen. Okay, so here's a slave auction notice. I'll remind you again, and I hope we can get to this movie in a minute. You're at school, 12 Years a Slave. People would, here's a 9-year-old being sold from her brother, right? And you got to assume mom is still back at Mr. White's house, right? So he sold, well, how much did he get for little Matilda? $425 on his $400 purchase. So what has he done with this? He's flipping it up,
Yeah,
upsell like you would do in real estate. He's taking this young girl and selling her. But look at this cost. Her brother gets left at home $750 because he's what? Crazy. He's gone nuts, right? Look at this. This guy is sold for $1,200, right? That 50% improvement on his cost, right?
Wait, so that would be like
hundreds of thousands, right? Yeah. Now look at this. I think this is fascinating. It's a great account. Now keep in mind, all of these are this one man slave ledger. This is one guy. This guy, who was 25, so that's ideal price, right? He bought him for $750, but he what? He ran away. So now he sold him for $200 less just to get rid of him. Not much good to have a runaway slave, right? Because if you ran away once, what? Okay, and you can see a young girl, teenage woman, huge. And so this is what I'm talking about the buying and selling of human beings, you know, daily business. This is an auction, what it looked like, a public auction. You also had auction houses, which were like rooms where you could go in and buy people. You know? So if you were a slave who had problems, like you had a mouth, not to be ugly, but like you would talk back, they would muzzle you. They would put chains on your neck. These are brands. So you'd be branded on your shoulder. You know, by
the hot iron.
Yeah, like a brand, like I do in Cali. Yeah. So I want to remind you, look at this number right here of blue, right? Look at Mississippi. Look at South Carolina. These are two of the states that were most vehemently opposed to any changes to slavery. Why? What's particularly about South Carolina and Mississippi? Black people are the majority of the population. More slave people there than there are white people there. Still true in these states today, more African Americans, right? Rare free blacks. Again, very rare, 250,000 total in the entire country. Well, I mean, yeah, it's sizable in the upper South.
Oh, well, yeah.
Right, but this is the one that's interesting. These are probably Creoles, meaning they were not slaves to begin with. They were people from the Caribbean who were there for whatever reason. They had been living there since before World War 1812. Yeah, but yeah, that's a good point. But definitely, when you look at these southern states along the Black Belt, they call it, these folks know full well that if anything happens to give slaves freedom, they're going to become a minority in a place that treats slaves brutally. They don't want that to happen. So when we think about slaves, what's extraordinary to me, first of all, slaves aren't monolithic. That isn't a monolith. That means there wasn't like one distinctive slave group. Now, I will give great credit to the historians who are doing really good work now on finding out heredity of slave traditions. And by that I mean, people say, oh, the legacy of slavery is over. I'm like, yeah, but no, it's not. I'm like, my last name, I can trace back to at least the 1500s. I've done genealogy that far back. If you're an African American whose last name is Jefferson, Washington, Hairston, you can go back about 5 generations and you run into a white guy. Because you don't know where you're from, your ancestry. This is why some African Americans during the Civil Rights era will lose their quote slave name. Some will adopt after the Civil War the most common name, Freeman. So today when you think about African Americans whose last name is Freeman, that's what that means. Freeman, like Morgan Freeman. So with these folks, one of the most fascinating contributions they're going to make to our culture as an American is in religion and in music. All right. So you have what is called the African Episcopalian and African Baptist, African American Baptist, African American Methodists that combine the old ring shout. You guys remember the ring shout? The ring shout was an Angolan and other West African religious tradition where people would stand in a circle, so to speak, and chant and sing, and then someone would get in the middle and would, so to speak, using more modern terms, testify. Right? So if you've ever been to an African American church and you're not African American, it is a very different experience than your typical Protestant church, typical white Protestant. And that is, it's much more emotional, much more charismatic, much more enthusiastic, and it usually involves much more of the congregation. And it's often, you know, keep in mind, guys, this is the only time when a slave could interact with other slaves without direct scrutiny. You understand what I mean by that? So the masters did actually encourage their slaves to be Christians. They really emphasized the language in the Bible about obeying your masters. But at the same time, these Africans frequently did become Christians, Baptists and Methodists particularly. Keep in mind, the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening had influence on the frontier. And so the Negro spiritual will move into so when I think about the civil rights era, what was Dr. Martin Luther King's profession? He was a minister, yeah. The civil rights era is reflective of the fact that the church becomes the center of the African American community. You understand? This is their one place where they can have sanctuary. They brought with them languages from West Africa, most notably Angola. That language would become known in America as Gola, Angolan and English combo. I think it's really important to recognize that they maintained their family name even when their families were sold. So they would try as far as they could to keep their family kinship network intact, even if separated. I think this book talks about the vows would say till death or distance do us part, right? But in other words, they would get word from plantation to plantation how their child was doing, how their family members were doing. So they kept their family intact in spite of distance. But perhaps, like I said, culturally in America, the most influence will be in the introduction of African music to American music, so to speak, becoming African American. It starts with the Negro spiritual, but guys, if you go back and listen to Ray Charles' music, you guys know why Ray Charles got in trouble and wouldn't be played initially? He took church songs and gave it torch music words. Torch music was sex music. So he took the rhythm of a church song and put risque lyrics over it, kind of thing. So, you know, the origin of rock and roll, jazz, the blues are coming out of this. All right, and so that's important, you know, obviously in American culture. Okay. Now, I mentioned to you that anti-slavery attitudes were fairly rare. There are a lot of reasons why they're rare. First of all, most people just don't like to rock the boat. Right? Like my mom. Another reason is out of sight, out of mind. You're not noticing. So one of the things you're going to notice about the earliest abolitionists is the attempt to raise public awareness. The attempt to get people to pay attention. Okay? But people aren't going to pay attention initially. And so here you can see the country that will be more successful initially at leading the abolitionist cause is Britain. America is slow to do it. All right? So here's some more of the slave things. So here's what I wanted to talk to you about before we finish tomorrow with abolitionism. And that is how you could resist if you were a slave. Keep in mind, today, you know, if my kid resists doing the labor that I tell them to do, I take away their I take away one of my son's Switch and the other one's Xbox. You know, they don't have phones yet, so that'd be the next on the list. Because you know that's punishment, but they know that that's what happens if they don't do it, right? Well, slaves, they have no incentive. It's not like they have a Switch or an Xbox or a raise. So how they would resist is pretty fascinating. So the first form is the most frequently recognized and really the most common, which was a creation of a charade, a pretense. Now, out of this comes a mocking character who unfortunately is today been used as racist. understand? But basically, this was the sort of acting. If you guys see Django, all right. Well, anyway, it's this fawning, yes kind of behavior. You understand? Acting like, totally subservient and obedient, but in reality, behind them, doing all kinds of nasty stuff. Okay? So this became Little Black Sambo, as he was called. All right? And this is the idea of, I'll let you look at the picture to understand. This is like the ugly caricature of what's called blackface, right? Keep in mind, this is the kind of stuff that culturally we're dealing with right now. So when you see Aunt Jemima no longer being Aunt Jemima, I don't know if you guys are following that or not, it's because she's this. She's a relic of the image of it. You understand? So it's like the caricature, but they actually played the part, because if you act like an idiot, guess what? People won't be as mean to you. So they would act simple. You understand? They would act submissive. So they just, and in the background, they can do whatever they wanted. But, this is going to be a character that goes well into the 20th century. But probably number 2 is the one that you would see happen routinely. They would fake getting sick. You guys might have done this with work for you, right? Well, they would fake it. Oh, I've got a terrible headache. They would fake it, or they would, have what we would consider a work stoppage or a work slowdown, just not being as productive. And you can only be a slave so much without it not being productive, right? So to speak. That would be the reason. Sometimes they poisoned their master. Sometimes they broke the gears of the cotton gin. So I would definitely be aware of these ways to disrupt the economy, right? They would work slower. They would, they would behind the scenes, kind of mess stuff up. Oh, I don't know what happened to the cotton gin. All right, sabotage. The rarest, but most notable was the Underground Railroad. If you've not seen the movie Harriet, about Harriet Tubman, fantastic movie to watch about it. Definitely recommend it. I think it's on Netflix right now. I just watched it again with my kids the other day. But escape, stealing yourself. Heard of Henry Box Brown? A little more creative self-rescues. He using money from abolitionists, he mailed himself to the North, like in a shipping package. So, but that wasn't typical. So the Underground Railroad was absolutely despised by Southern slave owners. And so, like I said, there was a whole industry of capturing who? Runaway slaves, right? This was just a cottage industry of, they would have like posses who were private pitchmen who would go out on the hunt. And this did happen rather routinely. Yeah, $1,200 for Negroes. All right, but I think he says it's like 6 or 8. I forget. It's a lot. Right? In other words, this was a kind of common thing. Now, what you would see is white people create secret messages that women and men like Harriet Tubman would then use to navigate these trades. So just to make sure everybody understands, the Underground Railroad is not literally underground. It's not a subway. Someone asked me that once. It's not like a train that ran, from Georgia to Maine, but it was a series of paths and roads and trails with people's basements and barns that would get you at least to Ohio, all right, or at least to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania being a home of a large Quaker population. Yeah.
Something I think is cool is that blue symbol. That is in there's a video game called Detroit Become Human. It's like about future AI. They become sentient.
What's the game called?
Detroit Become Human.
Detroit.
You play as the robots and you become sentient.
Okay.
And you have to try to
escape.
Yeah, basically, and you have to. One of the characters.
Okay, far out. Yeah, well, see, I'm all to say because I've played quite a few video games. Like a lot of video game designers clearly have a background history, between war games. That's really cool. Yeah, so definitely this would be a community of folks that would help families, if possible. Certainly some folks escape. And that's almost noteworthy. And then the fifth one, and this is by far the least common, but by far the most striking, was rebellion. Most frightening for whites. All right. Keep in mind, like I said, 1804, Haiti, which actually it started in 1791, but it ended in 1804. So throughout Latin America, slave rebellion. I mean, when we think about independence movements, we forget that most of the people fighting were former slaves or slaves, right? So that is going to, the idea of rebelling is going to become, more and more popular in the North. Now, the reason it doesn't happen nearly as much is that the penalty for rebellion was execution. All right, and so some slaves would actually snitch on rebellions that were about to take place with the hope of currying favor and getting, better treatment. Does that make sense? So people were really reluctant to rebel, but they did happen. So we're going to look at the three biggest rebellions in America prior to the Civil War. The first occurs in Richmond in 1800. Richmond, Virginia, Gabriel's Revolt, they call it. It never got off the ground. It never got going far. But it sure, keep in mind, this is early Upper South still, so it definitely put the fear into the slave owners. Gabriel's Revolt. The second is in South Carolina. Denmark Vesey's Rebellion. So you should know these two for sure. Denmark Vesey. His will be put down as well. Remember I told you how, I forget the total people who were executed here or killed.
When you say put down, do you mean anything actually happened?
Vesey and his 35, more than 30 were publicly hung. So they were caught prior to any large-scale revolt. These two are attempts. Your book is going to mention something called the Amistad, not a slave rebellion, but a fascinating story in 1839. Great movie on it. Steven Spielberg directed it. But the Amistad is actually the story of a group of Africans who were kidnapped and as slaves by the Portuguese and who rebelled on their slave ship, okay, and landed in New England. And then there was a huge debate about, well, what are they? Are they free people? Are they slaves? And their lawyer was a man named John Quincy Adams. All right, so you probably heard him. And they were paid for by an abolitionist named Lewis Tappan, who I'll show you in a minute. So, or tomorrow. So that happened on the seas really, really rare. So you asked about did anything big happen. So this is by far the most infamous of all the slave rebellions. Nat Turner rebellions. You definitely need to know this one, particularly as Virginians. I got a couple books back here on significance of that rebellion. Nat Turner. Never have I found, exception of maybe John Brown, a more divisive figure for students of history. You understand? For many, Nat Turner, keep in mind, Nat Turner was a preacher, an African-American preacher. He preached that God was coming back, Jesus, and that his duty was to free his people from slavery. Okay? So when you process the words, free my people from slavery, you're like, oh, well, that's cool. And then you see what Nat Turner did, and you're like, I can't see this guy as a hero, right? So this is this debate about, is he heroic when he's fighting against being a slave, or is he butchered? So, usually who you ask depends on what they feel about him. So you had this preacher with 60 men kill 58 men, women, and children in Southampton County. So Southampton, you guys know where the Great Dismal Swamp is? Like if you're headed east past Petersburg, that area. So on the way to Norfolk, okay? So kills 58 men, women, and children. They threw their bodies on the bonfires and left others be. They ransacked their houses and destroyed their property. They did not engage in rape or sexual assault. The governor, Governor Floyd, we got a county name after him, mobilized the state militia, which joined by units from North Carolina, halted the rebellion, executed about 120 people. Turner himself was captured and hung. So it's this debate about killing these folks. Is he heroic or not? You understand that you can see here, William Williams, wife and 2 boys. Nathaniel Francis, overseer and 2 children. So lots of women and kids. Now the people that were targeted were slave owners. And Nat Turner said he was at war with slavery. You'll notice down here, Turner did not kill everybody they encountered. Turner believed the poor white inhabitants thought no better of themselves than they did the Negroes. In other words, poor white people he didn't kill. They just killed people in these plantations. And this went on for, as you saw, from August until 2 weeks later, I think, before they're finally caught. So, well, not him, but the whole group. Yeah, over 100 people executed for this rebellion. So this will be a very, very horrifying moment in the minds of Virginians and really Southerners, because this is exactly what they're afraid of. Slaves killing their masters and their children. Okay? So this is why I told you Virginia was so close. I mean, I'm talking votes, as in like 1 or 2 people's votes away. I remember looking this up and being like stunned by this, really. So here's the date. After Nat Turner's rebellion, 40 or more petitions came into the government saying, we have to fix the problem around slavery in Virginia and what to do with free black people. The Richmond paper said, act on this, act on the problem. The other Richmond paper said, it's really a potential civil war between East and West. Who didn't have slaves? West Virginia. Keep in mind, West Virginia is Virginia at this point, right? And the West Virginian people are not sympathetic with the slave owner people. You understand? The mountain people are like, it's their fault for having slaves.
Chicken always looks weird.
Yeah, it is weird, right? Like our arm got ripped off, right?
Yeah.
Well, those mountain whites are not fans of slavery. You understand? So the governor does this. He reports on Nat Turner's rebellion and says we need to have harsher laws and that what should happen to free blacks? Colonization. This is what we were talking about yesterday. The only solution for Southerners to the end of slavery was colonization to Africa. Now, Nicholas said, and it's very common to say, keep in mind, Madison believed in this, Monroe believed in this. Keep in mind, Madison and Monroe are still alive during this. All right, so that was not an unusual thought. Now, it's not back to Africa, because these are not people who are actually from Africa, right? But that was the popular idea. And so in January, the House, look at this, the House drew up a scheme, a plan for what? Compensated emancipation. That means the government of Virginia would pay slave owners for their slaves and abolish slavery. That's how close we got in Virginia. All right? They debated it for a while. This guy, Good, said, nah, we shouldn't do that. All right? They voted, and they voted to decide to table it, what we would call it. So they got close. They got that close, January 2nd, to saying, let's end slavery in Virginia. But, you know, it's one of those things where it's like, that's how politics works. It's going to come down to individuals. Nonetheless, the issue of Nat Turner's rebellion horrified people because it seemed like butchery. You know, this is what you could see here, a horrid massacre. Now, defenders of Nat Turner would say, well, where's the, you know, combined butchery of all the people that were done to them, right? In other words, they would argue this is self-defense against what? And of course, killing children usually is not ever going to be accepted. You see this one about Mrs. Waller here, right? 10 kids. So I think had Nat Turner not killed his followers, not slaughtered children, keep in mind, this is the kind of stuff that scares people to this day. You know, it's about when folks rise up and kill people. You know, everybody's afraid of some group that's oppressed being angry. This is what happened in South Africa, why they went into apartheid for so long, because they didn't want to end it and then be slaughtered for it. This is what a lot of Southern whites are going to believe is going to happen if you give rights to black people. They're going to then persecute white people. So this is an interesting debate. Now, we're going to close with this today. The problem with slavery isn't just the evil that it was to African Americans. Keep in mind, when I say African Americans, you could be 7/8 Caucasian and still be considered what was called an octoroon, right? A black person. So race was really bizarre in our culture. What it meant was Southerners became very accustomed to violence. It would have been nothing at all to see people beat people on a routine basis. Southerners were also in constant fear of rebellion. Southern whites, obviously Southern blacks are, this is a story about white people right here. Southern blacks were terrified. But Southern whites were afraid of Southern blacks. I have a movie right here that I show my AP government class called Loving. It's about a Supreme Court case in 1958 here in Virginia called Loving versus Virginia. Before 1958, black people and white people could not get married in the city. There was an absolute disgust and hatred of black people by many, many white people. Fear. And then there is going to be an emergence of some malarkey, some fake pseudoscience to explain, well, white people are superior racially to black people. And they're going to use that as a justification. And as I mentioned before, here's Booker T saying, you cannot hold a person down in the ditch without getting down in the ditch with them. So what it did is, by perpetrating the evil of slavery, the Southern people became evil. You understand? And that's unfortunate that they didn't make an action to stop that. Okay, so tomorrow we will pick up with, let's finish this. This is the Southern defense of slavery. It's a good place to finish this. So I mentioned that pseudoscience, right? So one of the things that was relatively common was to hear Southern slave owners and even non-slave owners argue by the 1830s that slavery was not a necessary evil. They call this the positive good defense of slavery. So in other words, the mindset has changed. It went from being this evil institution that we have to do in order to survive to this thing that was actually good for the slaves. So why is it good? Well, it's in the Bible, and Aristotle writes about slaves. So classical sources and biblical sources have slavery in it. Here's a quote from the Bible: slaves obey your earthly masters with respect, with fear, and sincerity of heart, just as you would Christ. There it is. Slaves obey your master. End of story. Okay? Transplanted from the savagery of Africa, all right? From that to that. From being a savage in the wilds of Africa. Keep in mind, a fourth generation African American was not transplanted from the savagery of Africa. They were transplanted from the savagery of South Carolina. Right? Hey, what are you going to do? Now, this thesis is actually pretty fascinating. This is by a historian named Eugene Genovese. Eugene Genovese writes that slavery over time developed into a family relationship. Now, that sounds distorted, and it is. But what he means is that the owner began to perceive the slaves as their children, their wards, and that after spending their full lives with each other, they were practically family. And there are examples where that's somewhat true. For example, during the Civil War, there are slaves who could leave their plantations that they're on and go be free, and they don't. This is their home, for lack of a better word. Now, that doesn't mean it was good. It just means that I tend to think of this as almost like, what is it, Munchausen syndrome, where you start, no, which syndrome is it where you like, Stockholm syndrome, thank you. Yeah, Stockholm syndrome, where, over time, this is all you know. Okay? And then they make an interesting argument that, hey, our slaves work and then rest in the winter months, and, they go to bed at night, and it's not backbreaking all the time, and when they get older, we take care of them. Meanwhile, your wage slaves up north, you pay barely enough to survive, and then they're expendable, or disposable, sorry. So, while that might be true, that doesn't make slavery good. You understand? Nonetheless, they're going to use it like, don't condemn us Northerners. Y'all's way of life sucks compared to ours, right? So, yeah, this is called, again, the positive good. And you're going to see guys like Alexander Stephens from Georgia call Thomas Jefferson foolish for being critical of slavery. The evolution of Southern, my deep Southerners are going to say, oh, those upper Southerners were stupid when they said we can go. So tomorrow we'll pick up with abolitionism and this small movement that will become a brush fire. And hopefully we'll have the quiz over the weekend or by tomorrow afternoon, and you will have a test next week. Okay. Any last minute questions before I close out PowerPoint here? Huh? Unit test. Period test is 1848. So we got to get through James K. Polk, Mexican War. This test is 14, 15, and 16. Those three big thematic chapters. Yeah, go ahead.
I got did one of
All right.
the white slave district or discharge plan